Picture this. A war so vast it stretched from Alaska's frozen tundra to the humid jungles of the Pacific. Millions of American soldiers were shipped off to places they couldn't have found on a map before the war. And here's the kicker. When they arrived, there were no barracks, no houses, not even roofs over their heads. Just mud, rain, and the unforgiving elements. So how did the U.S. military fix this? They didn't ship lumber halfway around the world. They didn't waste time constructing elaborate bases. Instead, they came up with one of the strangest yet most effective solutions you've probably never heard of: the Quonset Hut. A curved, corrugated steel half-cylinder that could be built anywhere, anytime, and keep troops alive. Here's a number you'll remember. Over 100,000 Quonset Huts were built during World War II. That's not a typo. That's an industrial wave of steel and sweat turned into homes. Hospitals, command centers, and even chapels. Imagine landing on a remote Pacific island in 1943 and watching one of these rise from the ground in a single day, ready to house dozens of soldiers. It might sound like science fiction, but it was very real. And here's the surprising part. These huts weren't just quick military fixes. They represented a quiet revolution in logistics and housing. Think about it. World War II wasn't fought only with bullets and tanks. It was fought with supply lines, infrastructure, and the ability to keep troops fed, sheltered, and ready to fight. The Germans had fortresses. The Japanese had caves. The Americans? They had a portable, packable, nearly indestructible hut, one that shipped flat, could be assembled by a handful of men, and could survive a typhoon. It's the kind of advantage you won't see in Hollywood war films, but it made all the difference. And if you're thinking, it's just a hut, stick around, because these didn't vanish after the war. After 1945, they became part of everyday American life. College dorms, churches, diners, and even housing for returning GIs under the GI Bill. Some still stand today, rusted, weathered, but enduring reminders of a time when the U.S. was producing war materials at a scale the world had never witnessed. In this video, we'll explore how the Quonset Hut was born, how it spread across the globe like wildfire, what life inside one was really like, and how something designed to be temporary became a permanent mark on history. It's a story of steel, sweat, and pure American ingenuity. And trust me, after this, you'll never look at a half-cylinder the same way again. By late 1941, America faced a logistical nightmare. The attack on Pearl Harbor had thrust the U.S. into a global war demanding troops in every corner of the planet. Millions of men were being deployed, and each one needed food, water, and shelter. But the problem was obvious. How do you house an army constantly on the move? Traditional wooden barracks took too long to build, and shipping heavy materials across oceans was impossible. The military needed something new. Fast, cheap, portable, and strong enough to handle everything from blizzards to monsoons. This wasn't just about comfort. Soldiers in North Africa, the Pacific, or Alaska couldn't afford to fall ill or collapse from exhaustion. Every sick or weakened soldier was more than a personal loss. It was a break in the chain of war. American planners knew they had to solve the shelter problem before it cost lives and battles. The question wasn't if they'd find a solution, but how fast. That's when the Navy stepped in. Even before Pearl Harbor, in early 1941, the U.S. Navy realized it would need portable housing for its expanding bases. They didn't want flimsy tents that tore in the wind, or wooden huts that rotted in the tropics. They wanted a structure that could be packed up, shipped anywhere, and assembled with minimal tools, something sailors or soldiers could erect in hours, not weeks. At the time, the U.S. had tested the British Nissen hut, designed in World War I by Major Peter Nissen, also a curved steel structure used in France. But American planners decided it wasn't quite right. They wanted something stronger, simpler, and easier to mass-produce in U.S. factories. In short, they wanted an American version. That's where Quonset Point, Rhode Island, enters the story. It was there that the Navy commissioned the first prototype of what would become the Quonset Hut. The timing couldn't have been better. As the nation geared up for total war in 1941, the race was on to build not just weapons and ships, but an entire portable world to house the men who would fight. By the time American troops began shipping out in early 1942, the groundwork for their new homes was already in place. What looked like a simple curved shell was actually the answer to one of World War II's biggest logistical problems. It wasn't glamorous, but without it, thousands of men would have been left exposed, not only to enemy fire, but to the brutal realities of weather and terrain. This wasn't just about architecture. It was about survival, and America was about to show that solving massive problems quickly and at scale was one of its greatest wartime strengths. When the Navy called for a new type of building in 1941, the task went to the architects and engineers of the George A. Fuller Company, working at the Davisville Naval Construction Battalion Center in Rhode Island. The goal sounded simple but was anything but. Design a structure that was light, cheap, packable, and easy to assemble by untrained men using basic tools, yet strong enough to withstand Arctic cold, tropical heat, and everything in between. The result was brilliantly simple. Imagine a half-cylinder made of corrugated steel sheets, arched into a 16 by 36-foot structure. That semicircular shape wasn't just for looks. It gave the hut remarkable strength, allowing wind, rain, and snow to roll right off. Each end was closed with plywood panels that could include doors, windows, or vents depending on the climate. Inside, huts could be insulated or left bare. They sat on simple wooden or concrete foundations, depending on the terrain. The first prototypes were built at Quonset Point in mid-1941, giving the huts their name. They weren't fancy or comfortable, but they were exactly what the Navy needed. Packed into crates, shipped across oceans, and bolted together on site, a crew of 6 to 8 men could raise one in a single day. Compared to the weeks required for traditional barracks, it's clear why the Quonset hut became an instant success. The original 16-foot wide design proved too small for many uses, so engineers soon expanded it to 20 and even 40 feet wide. Variants appeared for nearly every function: barracks, mess halls, offices, hospitals, and chapels. The modular system meant huts could be connected, extended, or modified on the fly, a priceless advantage in war zones where needs changed overnight. By late 1941, the Navy had placed massive production orders. The design was finalized, factories were stamping out corrugated panels by the ton, and the Quonset hut was officially ready for war. Official production had already begun, even as America was still reeling from the shock of Pearl Harbor. By the time U.S. troops landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942, Quonset huts were already waiting to shelter them. It's easy now to see the Quonset hut as inevitable, but it wasn't. It emerged from a moment of urgency, born from the union of industrial strength and practical design. Without Quonset Point, without that crucial Navy order, and without the swift work of its engineers, the war could have looked very different in the Pacific and beyond. The genius of the Quonset hut lay in its simplicity: curved steel ribs, plywood ends, and a promise. No matter where American troops went, they'd have a place to call home, even if only for a night. Once the design was finalized in 1941, the United States didn't just build Quonset huts, it mass-produced them on an unprecedented scale. America's factories were already turning out Liberty ships, Sherman tanks, and B-17 bombers. Adding a simple steel hut to that list seemed minor, yet it became one of the most widespread wartime products of all. By 1945, more than 100,000 Quonset huts had rolled off production lines, enough to house entire armies. How was that possible? The answer was the same principle that defined American wartime industry: mass production. Factories across the country retooled to stamp corrugated steel, cut plywood panels, and pack complete kits that contained every bolt, nut, and instruction sheet required. Each hut shipped as a flat-pack kit weighing around 5 tons. These could be loaded into Liberty ships alongside jeeps, rations, and ammunition, then offloaded anywhere in the world. The Fuller Company and its partners avoided complex blueprints. Every hut followed a standard design, allowing workers to assemble them like automobiles on an assembly line. Dimensions were uniform, parts interchangeable, and instructions straightforward. A crate of Quonset components was essentially a giant Lego set for grown men, except these pieces built the infrastructure of a global war. The numbers tell the story best. In 1942, the Navy ordered over 25,000 huts almost immediately, and production only accelerated. Factories in Rhode Island, New Jersey, and later across the Midwest worked nonstop. By 1943, entire ships departed American ports, carrying nothing but Quonset hut kits, and the men trained to assemble them. Production moved so quickly that huts were often completed faster than the military could decide where to send them. The real miracle, though, was how few men it took to raise one. 6 to 8 soldiers with wrenches and hammers could erect a hut in less than a day. No cranes, no carpenters, no engineers on site, just manpower and a box of parts. That speed transformed newly captured islands into functioning bases almost overnight. Airstrips suddenly had barracks for pilots, kitchens for mess halls, and offices for command posts. A patch of jungle could become a small city within a week. It's worth comparing this to America's enemies. While German troops dug bunkers and Japanese garrisons hid in caves, U.S. forces were building steel towns that rose almost instantly. It wasn't glamorous, but it meant that wherever the American flag landed, a fully operational base followed soon after. By war's end, Quonset hut production rivaled some of the largest military hardware programs of the conflict. These huts were more than temporary housing. They were a symbol of America's ability to outproduce, outbuild, and outsupply its enemies. Sending soldiers overseas was one thing. Giving them a ready-made home waiting in a crate was another entirely. Living in a Quonset hut was a unique experience for most American troops. For many, it was their first time away from home, and suddenly their house was a curved steel shell on foreign soil. They weren't luxurious by any means, but compared to leaking tents or freezing nights, they were a blessing. Interiors could be modified to fit different climates. Insulated walls and mosquito screens in the Pacific, stoves and wooden floors in colder regions like Alaska or Northern Europe. Makeshift partitions offered a hint of privacy, though most soldiers remembered them as echoing, noisy, and often sweltering. But the Quonset hut was never meant to be just a barracks. Its adaptability made it whatever the military needed. Some served as mess halls where hundreds lined up for rations. Others became field hospitals filled with cots and the scent of antiseptic. Some turned into chapels with improvised altars beneath the curved roof, where soldiers sang hymns thousands of miles from home. They also became command posts, classrooms, storage depots, and even makeshift theaters for movie nights. If it needed a roof, the Quonset hut could provide one. Arriving on an island like Guadalcanal in 1943, one would have seen a sea of huts rising almost overnight, transforming a raw stretch of jungle into a functioning military base. These huts brought a surprising sense of permanence to places that were otherwise unfamiliar and unforgiving. They became symbols of American ingenuity, evidence that no matter how far from home soldiers were sent, order and structure followed. Of course, they weren't without flaws. The steel walls amplified the drumming of tropical rain until it became nearly unbearable. In the heat, the interiors turned into ovens, and poor ventilation made the humidity oppressive enough to warp wooden ends. Yet soldiers adapted, fashioning makeshift fans, cutting new windows, and doing whatever was necessary to make the huts livable. Compared to foxholes or open-air tents, they were still an improvement. Letters from GIs often mentioned the huts, sometimes jokingly, sometimes in frustration, but nearly always with gratitude. They offered shelter, and that alone meant a great deal. As one Marine stationed in the Pacific put it, "She ain't pretty, but she keeps the rain out." That's all a man can ask for. Most importantly, the huts gave troops a fleeting sense of normalcy. You could hang your gear, straighten your cot, and for at least one night feel protected from the jungle or the desert. For a soldier far from home, that bit of comfort was priceless. The Quonset hut didn't remain confined to American camps. It spread rapidly across the globe with the advance of U.S. forces. From the beaches of Normandy to the jungles of New Guinea, these half-moon shelters became part of the World War II landscape. No matter how remote the location, it was likely you'd find a cluster of huts forming the backbone of a base. In the Pacific, they proved indispensable. When U.S. Marines landed on Tarawa in 1943, or Iwo Jima in early 1945, securing ground meant more than just victory. It meant building infrastructure. Quonset huts made that possible almost instantly. Airfields required control towers, radio rooms, weather stations, and repair shops. Instead of waiting weeks for construction, crates were unpacked, steel arches bolted, and within days the bare islands were filled with buildings. Some bases ended up with hundreds of huts arranged like small towns, complete with streets and signposts. In Europe, they were just as critical. After D-Day in June 1944, as Allied troops pushed deeper into France, Quonset huts followed close behind. They served as makeshift hospitals, offices for logistics teams, and barracks for engineers. By winter, during the Battle of the Bulge, they became heated shelters, welcome relief from the freezing Belgian forests. Even in extreme environments, the huts proved their worth. In Alaska and the Aleutian Islands, they were reinforced to withstand hurricane-force winds and bitter cold. In North Africa, they stood under scorching sun, their curved steel roofs reflecting heat far better than canvas tents ever could. The same principle held everywhere. A flat-pack building could be shipped and assembled faster than any traditional structure. By 1945, Quonset huts could be found on every continent except Antarctica. Soldiers joked that you could trace the path of the U.S. military by spotting those steel arches on the horizon. They became unmistakable symbols of American presence, recognizable even to civilians who had never seen them up close. Allied nations used them too, supplied through Lend-Lease programs that sent huts to Britain, Australia, and the Soviet Union. They worked simply because they were practical, and because no other nation had solved mobile housing on such a scale. So common were they that many soldiers assumed they'd last forever. They turned barren outposts into functioning communities, imposed order amid chaos, and gave troops the infrastructure to keep fighting thousands of miles from home. If war is about logistics, then the Quonset hut was one of America's quietest yet most effective weapons. By the war's end, whether you stood on a Pacific atoll, a French farm, or an Arctic outpost, you'd see the same curved roofs against the skyline. They were proof that America hadn't just deployed soldiers overseas, it had exported an entire way of life. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, most assumed the Quonset hut would disappear with the war. Designed as a temporary solution to an urgent problem, it seemed destined to fade away, but it didn't. Instead, it began a surprising second life, one that would shape post-war America in ways few expected. The U.S. military had built over 100,000 huts, and when peace arrived, it suddenly faced a surplus. Many were scrapped, but thousands were shipped home or left standing abroad. The timing couldn't have been better. America faced a housing crisis. Millions of returning GIs and their families needed homes, and the GI Bill was filling colleges with new students. Cities and universities turned to Quonset huts as a fast, practical solution to meet the demand for living space. Across the United States, colleges built entire hut villages for returning veterans. At the University of Michigan, for instance, former GIs and their families lived in Quonset hut communities, complete with kitchens, bedrooms, and even small yards. Other universities like Minnesota, Brown, and UCLA followed suit. These villages were far from luxurious. Many wives joked about cooking in their half-cylinder kitchens, but they were cheap, quick to set up, and better than nothing. Beyond college campuses, entire towns grew around Quonset hut neighborhoods. Some huts were transformed into churches, diners, and even dance halls. Small businesses bought surplus huts and converted them into workshops, garages, and warehouses. Farmers embraced them too, using the huts as barns and storage sheds. For a generation shaped by wartime scarcity, these ready-made buildings felt like small miracles. And the idea didn't stop in America. Overseas, Quonset huts left behind during the war were absorbed into local communities. In places like the Philippines, Guam, and parts of Europe, they became homes, schools, and shops long after U.S. troops had departed. What was meant to disappear after the war became a global symbol of recovery and resilience. Still, the huts weren't without flaws. Families often complained about poor insulation, leaking roofs, and the constant creak of metal. Winters were freezing, and summers unbearably hot. Yet for many, these huts meant stability in an uncertain post-war world, a temporary refuge while something more permanent took shape. The surprising part? Some huts refused to vanish. By the 1950s and 60s, thousands were still standing, patched with new siding, windows, and insulation. Even today, original Quonset huts can be found scattered across the American landscape, some rusting and forgotten, others still used as storage or workshops. What began as a wartime necessity ended up reshaping peacetime America. The Quonset hut became more than shelter. It was a bridge from the chaos of war to the hope of rebuilding. Like the soldiers who once lived in them, these huts proved stronger and more enduring than anyone imagined. Nearly 80 years after World War II, the Quonset hut hasn't disappeared. It remains a lasting symbol of wartime ingenuity and industrial problem-solving. Drive across the U.S. and you'll still spot them. Those curved, corrugated steel shells standing stubbornly in fields, on campuses, or behind old garages. Some are battered and rusted, others carefully restored, but each tells the same story. Built fast, built cheap, built to last. The legacy of the Quonset hut goes beyond nostalgia. Architects and historians see it as an early example of modern prefabricated housing. The concept of shipping flat pack, kits for on-site assembly, something we now associate with companies like IKEA, was already being done on a massive scale in 1941. The hut proved that modular design could be both practical and scalable, sparking post-war conversations about solving housing shortages through mass-produced homes. For veterans, the huts carried deep emotional weight. They remembered them as the backdrop of their wartime lives, the place where they wrote letters home, laughed with comrades, or collapsed into exhausted sleep after battle. For civilians, the huts became a familiar sight, dotting landscapes from Rhode Island to the Pacific. They symbolized not just military strength, but American adaptability and resourcefulness. Culturally, the Quonset hut even gained icon status. Artists painted them, filmmakers used them as sets, and writers referenced them as shorthand for the wartime experience. By the 1950s, they were fixtures of American pop culture, representing both the hardship of war and the optimism of rebuilding. In some towns, people still gather in community centers that were once surplus Quonset huts, their curved roofs arching over dances, meetings, and Sunday services. The story doesn't end there. In the 21st century, architects and DIY builders have rediscovered the Quonset form for eco-friendly housing and affordable shelters. The same principles that worked in 1942, simplicity, durability, and cost efficiency, still apply today. Some companies now produce modernized Quonset-style structures for farms, workshops, and homes, proving that the design never truly went out of style. Perhaps that's the most remarkable legacy of all. These huts were meant to be temporary, yet like the veterans who once called them home, they endured. They became monuments to a generation's struggle and triumph, silent witnesses to a war that changed the world. So next time you see one of those curved steel shells standing quietly by the roadside, remember, the humble Quonset hut helped win a world war, housed soldiers across continents, and went on to shape post-war life in ways no one could have predicted. In its own quiet way, it stands beside the Jeep, the Sherman tank, and the Liberty ship as a true symbol of World War II, proof that sometimes the simplest solutions leave the longest legacy.